There are a lot of concerns that you might hear people saying, this situation is a little bit hopeless because of climate change, because the weather is just becoming so extreme. There's nothing that we can do personally, no management that we can undertake to actually affect to mitigate this fire severity problem. And our study shows that this really isn't true. There was this really important interaction between the how extreme the weather conditions were and the forest structural conditions. And what it showed is that when weather is more extreme, the effective forest structure is actually larger. So what does that mean? Well, if we think about it sort of in the context of fuels treatments like thinning or prescribed fire that remove trees that create more heterogeneity, that means that in warmer climates, those treatments are actually going to have a larger effect on fire severity. They're going to be better at reducing fire severity under extreme conditions. They're still going to be effective. And that's, a really hopeful finding because it means that if we can get our act together, we can really put management on the ground that mitigates these mega fire risks.
I'm Meg Carney, an outdoor and environmental journalist, and this is the Outdoor Minimalist Podcast. Thank you for joining us so that together we can create a better outdoor space as we recreate. Wildfires are reshaping the landscape of the American West, and with them, the way we think about public lands and climate resilience. Over the past few decades, fires have grown larger, more severe, and harder to predict. As climate change accelerates and management debates intensify, the stakes couldn't be higher for our forests. And today we're digging into the science behind these trends and what they mean for the future of our public lands. Joining us is Jacob Levine, whose research explores the complex intersection of climate, land management, and wildfire behavior. Jacob is a plant community ecologist and wildfire scientist whose work looks at how climate change, forest management, and extreme weather shapes the way fires behave, and how managers, policymakers, and communities can foster more resilient landscapes. He earned his PhD in 2024 from Princeton University and is currently a Wilkes postdoctoral fellow in climate science and policy at the University of Utah, and scholar in residence at Duke University. So thank you so much for joining me on the Outdoor Minimalist Podcast today, Jacob. I am excited to delve a little bit deeper into the topic of wildfires. I know it's something that a lot of our listeners in the West have to live with, so I think they'll appreciate what you have to say. But to start, can you give us a little bit more background about yourself and what actually got you interested and started in studying wildfires?
Yeah, so I am currently a scientist at the University of Utah. I have basically a fellowship there to work on issues pertaining to climate science and policy for a period of about 2 years. And what initially got me interested into wildfires? Well, I grew up in Los Angeles. So wildfires, as you mentioned, were a part of my life, ever since I can remember. I remember schools or class being canceled due to smoke, and it just being sort of a pervasive part of life. And when I moved up to the Bay Area for college was in the 2014 to 2018 year, which was, major drought happening, and then sort of the start of this mega fire era where we started getting these absolutely massive wildfires burning hundreds of thousands of acres, more or less every summer. And that sort of inspired me to get involved in wildfire research. So I joined a lab there that focuses on studying wildfires in California. And as I've sort of moved further along in my career, I've kept that focus as at least one of my interests.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, over the last few decades, really last like 10 or so years, we've been seeing kind of an increase in the number of wildfires, but also the severity of those fires that are happening in the West. And so from your perspective as a scientist, what do you think has been driving this trend, or what trends have you observed?
Yeah, so just as you mentioned, fires are becoming more severe and also larger over time. And when we're talking about fire severity, we're talking about the impacts of a given fire. So how many of the trees that were standing before that fire burned through an area were actually killed by the fire. And we're particularly concerned with an impact called high severity fire, which is when more than 95% of the overstory trees are killed in an area, because that has particularly bad consequences from an ecological standpoint. And is also associated with things like extreme fire behavior, which is dangerous to us, more smoke impacts, more emissions, various other negative things. And so fires, as I mentioned, are becoming more severe. That incidence of that high severity effect is becoming greater with time. And you ask, what is driving that increase? Well, it's a few things. The obvious sort of big one is climate change. The West and most of the world is becoming hotter. Our summers are becoming drier. We're having more variability in precipitation, which means that we have some years that are really wet, some years that are really dry. We often have a lot of that precipitation concentrated in fewer storms, which often provides these pulses of fuels that then dry out significantly over the summer, and then burn during these sort of big wind-driven events. There's also been an increase in the sort of in the amount of dry lightning storms in the West, and particularly in California, which are starting more fires and creating these situations where you have, many ignitions happening at the same time. The most famous example of this was a couple years ago back in 2020. Actually, you know what? I'm not 100% sure about that, so I'm going to scratch that. Can I just start again and pick up where I was talking from, or do you want me to start the whole answer over?
No, you can pick up where you were. That's fine.
Okay. What was I saying? Yeah, an increase in the incidence of these dry lightning storms. And so all of those are contributing to the increase in the size and the severity of wildfires. In particular, the fact that when fires are burning, it tends to be hotter, drier, and windier. And those things really drive extreme fire behavior. Now, it's not just climate, it's also how we have managed our forests over the last several hundred years. So a big issue that you hear people talk about a lot is fire suppression. So essentially, a lot of our ecosystems in the West were sort of adapted to burn pretty frequently. There's some variation. Some systems like the chaparral shrublands in Southern California and lodgepole pine forests in Colorado, they're adapted to burn less frequently, maybe once every 60 to 120 years. But a lot of forests, particularly those in dry conifer forests in the Sierra Nevada and California, and other sort of mountainous regions in the West, were adapted to burn really frequently, every 5 to 15 years. And so what those fires did is they really, cleared out a lot of the understory. They often created a more sort of heterogeneous structure in the forest. So you'd have patches of trees that are killed, patches that remain alive, because those fires are sort of lower intensity than the types of fires that we're seeing now. Now, those fires were started both by lightning, but also by Native Americans. And so when the United States took over all of these lands in the West and started managing them, they were very, of course, anti-fire, because it was viewed as a waste of important timber resources. And so they developed a policy where they forced the cessation of indigenous burning practices. So that prevented a lot of ignitions on the landscape. And they also developed a policy of trying to put out every single fire as soon as possible. And so we were very good at this. We developed very good technologies and protocols for putting fires out. And so that led to a huge decrease in the amount of fire across the landscape. And as a result of that, we don't have these sort of clearing fires anymore. The forests have become remarkably more dense. A lot of the trees, especially sort of more fire-prone trees, less fire-resilient trees, were no longer being sort of culled by these regular fires. They become a lot more prevalent on the landscape. And so now what we're left with is a very dense, often unhealthy stands of trees across many of our forests in the West. And those are significantly more fire-prone than the sort of historic forest conditions would have been. And so it's really that combination of our management of the forest. And we're going to talk, I'm sure, a little bit more about the details of forest management in a second, but combined with the sort of increasing climate problem that are driving these mega fires.
Yeah, I'm glad that you included that history of kind of like how forest management has evolved over time. And then we'll
Mhm.
get into a little bit about how we maybe can transition into like a more holistic view of fire management. But I do want to talk a little bit about a recent study that you worked on that was published this year, 2025. And it did look at some land management approaches between private industrial forests and then also public lands. And I guess, do you want to give us like a high level overview of what that research revealed about management and fire outcomes?
Sure. So the purpose of this research project that you mentioned was to understand how different management approaches and different sort of large actors in forest management, in particular private industry, people who grow trees for profit, versus the federal government, the Forest Service, Park Service, et cetera, how those two approaches to forest management affect the severity of wildfires that occur on those landscapes. And also then to understand how management interacts with climate, trying to understand, which one is sort of more important, or how do they interactively determine the outcomes of large fires. And this took place in California. And we were able to do this study because we were very lucky in a way, although sort of the circumstances around this data set that I'm about to talk about are less lucky. Basically, in 2019, the federal government, several agencies, the NASA, the Forest Service, and the USGS, the Geological Survey, all collaborated to develop what's called a airborne LiDAR data set. So these are planes that they fly over a forest that shoot out hundreds of millions of lasers, and those, by measuring the time it takes for those lasers to bounce back to the aircraft, we can build basically a 3D picture of the entire forest over very large regions. And so this gives us an incredibly detailed look at what the forest actually looks like. What are the structures that are created on these different types of lands, on federal lands versus private industrial lands? Um, the reason I said that it was lucky is that that entire area in which this LiDAR data set was collected then was, or most of that area was burned in 5 large wildfires that occurred following the collection of that data set. So those were the biggest fire in that sort of region was the Dixie Fire, which you may have heard of. It's the largest single source fire in California history, burned over 1 million acres, burned for multiple months. And this is in the northern Sierra Nevada, southern Cascades, and in northeastern California. And so it's a really unique opportunity to understand how the structures that these different management approaches generate, the sort of picture of the forest, how that affects the behavior of these wildfires. Now, of course, it's a very sad circumstance. It's an area of the country that's very beautiful. It's the Plumas National Forest and surrounding private lands. But of course, the silver lining here that comes out of some of those fires is we might be able to learn something about how to prevent future ones from becoming that bad. And so, what do we find? Well, what we found is that by associating different sort of characteristics of the forest before the fire with the outcome, the sort of whether or not a given area burned at high severity after the fire, we were able to determine that regions of the forest that had high density, a large number of trees per acre, that were where those trees were arranged homogeneously, for example, like in a grid pattern as opposed to in a more clumpy pattern that has larger spaces in the middle. And also forests that had a high degree of what we call ladder fuels, which are basically low-lying branches, small trees, shrubs that provide essentially a ladder for fire to move from the ground into the canopy. And that, of course, exacerbates fire behavior because once you have a fire burning from tree to tree in the canopy, it can really take off and kill a lot more trees than if it were burning sort of in the understory. And so those 3 characteristics were most strongly associated with the probability of an area burning at high severity. So denser, more homogeneous, higher ladder fuels, all bad from a fire perspective. We also found that areas that are managed by private industrial timber companies tend to have forests that look more like that tend to be denser, more homogeneous, and have higher ladder fuels. And the reason for that, we suspect, is because timber companies, at least in this region and across a lot of the Western US, tend to practice something called plantation management or even-aged management. And this is characterized by a strategy where you typically cut down a large area of the forest. In California, that's limited to 20 acres. In Oregon and Washington and other states, that can be quite a bit larger, up to 100 acres. And this is what we call clear cuts. So often, almost every tree is removed. Sometimes some are left standing for habitat or for regeneration purposes. But practically all the trees are removed from an area. The company will then come in and plant at high densities new trees, which will then grow up and in 80 years be cut down again and harvested for their timber. And this cycle sort of repeats. And so across the landscape, you have all of these very homogeneous stands of trees at different stages of development. And that's basically creates this extremely regular structure where all the crowns tend to be touching. There's this continuous fuel bed. And that really allows these fires to gain a lot of energy, and we believe to increase sort of the severity of those fires, the number of trees that are killed. And this is compared to the Forest Service, which tends to have, because they're not practicing, as much in active management, their goal is not just to produce timber, although it often part of their goal is to produce timber. It's also to manage lands for grazing, for recreation, for water quality, many other things. And also because they're beholden to the public, they're often sued whenever they try to do timber operations. And we'll talk about that more later, I'm sure, as well. Because of that, they tend to have a more laissez-faire approach to their forests. And so their forests look a lot, they're still dense, but they have a lot more heterogeneity. There's some open areas. They're not arranged in a grid. The trees are not all even aged. They're not all the same age, so their crowns are not all touching necessarily. And that seems to fare better under when the fire burns through the area. Now, a couple of things that are important to note is one, just because the Forest Service does better does not mean that it is doing well. The probability of high severity fire on Forest Service lands in our study was still over 50%. That's way, way higher than what we would like it to be. It's certainly higher than what it historically was. It would have been closer to 10 to 15%. And so that's still a huge problem. And so, just because the management on private industrial lands appears to be faring worse is not a tacit endorsement of what's happening on public lands either. And the final piece of this study is the interaction with climate that I mentioned. And so there are a lot of concerns that you might hear people saying, this situation is a little bit hopeless because of climate change, because the weather is just becoming so extreme. There's nothing that we can do personally, no management that we can undertake to actually affect, to mitigate this fire severity problem. And our study shows that this really isn't true. There was this really important interaction between how extreme the weather conditions were and the forest structural conditions. And what it showed is that when weather is more extreme, the effective forest structure is actually larger. So what does that mean? Well, if we think about it sort of in the context of fuels treatments like thinning or prescribed fire that remove trees that create more heterogeneity, that means that in warmer climates, those treatments are actually going to have a larger effect on fire severity. They're going to be better at reducing fire severity under extreme conditions. They're still going to be effective. And that's, a really hopeful finding, because it means that if we can get our act together, we can really put management on the ground that mitigates these mega fire risks.
So in your study, did you also look at how then fires are fought, like on the ground while they're actively burning, or was it primarily just kind of like how they spread? Because I am interested in how those different industrial forests or like public lands, the multiple use forests, how they respond to fires differently. And if the roadless rule would then factor into the spread and management afterwards.
Yeah, so we did not look at actual suppression activities, actual firefighting activities in this study. It's something that's very hard to do. It's hard to get data on exactly what was happening on the ground at different times. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind, because Often, maybe these lands might have different sort of levels of firefighting resources. Often private industrial lands tend to be closer to roads. There's no wilderness areas in industrial timberlands for the most part because they need to access those lands. So that often means that they have more access to suppression resources than wilderness areas on the Forest Service, for example. Of course, that can't explain the difference in fire severity between the two landscapes because we observed higher probabilities of fire severity on those easier to access forests. And so really what we're looking at is how the forest structure itself affects fire spread. And we have to sort of ignore fire suppression for now, although we'd certainly like to investigate that in the future. Now, the roadless rule, I think the biggest implications of this study for that in terms of policy is that what the study really shows is that the most effective tools for reducing the severity of fires are thinning and prescribed fire. Now, the most important forest structural characteristic was the number of trees per acre. And so that implies that in order to reduce the severity of future fires, we need to actually get in there and remove trees from the forest. Typically smaller trees, typically trees that are unhealthy or that are less fire resilient. We want to be able to create more heterogeneity, open up some gaps that allow a greater diversity of plant types to sort of thrive in those environments. And that also helps to slow down wildfires as they burn through. And, being able to put a prescribed fire on the ground or to do a thinning operation requires access to a given area. And so, people who are proposing the roadless rule right now, I think what they have in mind is timber production. They want to open up areas of the forest for logging. Now, logging is not inherently bad. As I just told you, logging can be used in a very productive way to mitigate fire severity. But if the goal is to go in clear cut areas and plant these dense plantations, that's certainly going to be counterproductive from a fire standpoint. If building roads allows us to actually access hard to reach areas currently and implement some of these active management practices like thinning and prescribed fire, there could be some benefit from a fire perspective.
Yeah, that's kind of the vibe that I have been getting from the discussions on the roadless rule is that, yeah, wildfire management needs to be kind of altered to a degree, and the roadless rule could be updated, but perhaps implementing more industrial logging isn't the appropriate approach in terms of how fires have been progressing over the years. And then reading your study, I was like, oh, yeah, this could be really bad.
Yeah, certainly our study shows that this type of plantation management is not beneficial from a fire standpoint. And really, again, the problem is not logging itself. It's really what the forest structures that are created after an area is logged. Of course, there are some negative impacts of logging on fire severity as well, because it creates a lot of sort of detritus and wood material that is not actually harvested, that is often left in the area, and that can form a really good fuel bed for fires. But really, what our research shows is that the problem is these dense, very homogeneous stands of trees that are planted after an area is logged.
Okay, well, then kind of like moving out away from that study, you can reference it if it becomes relevant again. But like from some of your other work and observations in the wildfire space, do you think that, or how do you think that high severity wildfires are kind of impacting ecosystems as a whole then? Because we're seeing them happen so much more frequently. Wildfire seasons in the West are getting much longer. How do you think that's playing a role in terms of like ecosystem health, wildlife habitat, general migration thing? I know there's a lot of questions coming, but like just in general.
Yeah, so we're really concerned about high severity fire in particular that affect where more than basically all of the overstory trees that were in an area are killed by a fire. We're really concerned about that because it has sort of distinct ecological consequences. And, I study primarily California, and most of the trees in California do not have specific adaptations to severe fire. And so that means that when these areas burn at high severity, when you kill all the trees in an area, you're not just killing the adult individuals, you're also burning up all of the seed source for that area. And so as more and more parts of these fires are burning at high severity, and as larger contiguous patches of these fires are burning to the point that there are no living mature trees, or at least very few, what we're seeing is that the trees can't really come back. They don't stand a fighting chance against their competitors, which are typically shrubs, and in some cases, grasses. So what's happening is we're seeing basically conversion of historically forested regions to shrub and grasslands at a pretty rapid rate. And this is actually sort of an interesting component to the study that I just talked about, because one of the, sort of caveats to that study, to the fact that fire outcomes are worse on private industrial land, is that they're often back there planting trees immediately after a fire. Now, of course, the way that they do that tends to, increase fire probability in some way, but those trees will eventually become a seed source. Whereas on Forest Service land, they don't have the bandwidth, the funding, the manpower to actually go in and regenerate these large areas that have burned in wildfires. And so it tends to be that right along these property lines, 10 years after a fire, you'll see one side that's owned by the Forest Service is all shrubs, and the other side has basically a plantation of trees. And, I'd argue that neither of those are ideal outcomes from an ecological standpoint, but if we're interested in maintaining our forests, having some source of trees around is important. So yeah, obviously it's very concerning that we're getting these transitions from forest to shrublands. And that's concerning because, one, it is a reduction in habitat for species that like forests. For example, the California spotted owl is a big one that really needs mature forests in order to thrive. It's a reduction in the carbon storage potential of that area. Trees store more carbon than shrubs and grasses. It affects water quality and water sort of delivery and the timing of water delivery from the mountains, which provide, most of the drinking water for the West. And it is bad from a recreation standpoint. I mean, shrublands can be very pretty. I mentioned I'm from LA and I love recreating in the very beautiful shrublands in Southern California. But, when we think about the Sierra Nevada and, the Rockies and the Cascades, we think about these majestic forests. And the fact that we're losing them at such a large clip is really concerning. It means that, that way of thinking about these landscapes that, we've sort of grown up with and have loved, future generations might have to adapt to very different looking environments.
Yeah, all of those changes so rapidly can be very jarring and kind of scary. Like you mentioned before, it's a lot of, wildfires in general are kind of like a terrifying event. If you look at like what happened
Yeah.
last year with the LA fires and then in Hawaii previously as well, especially when they enter kind of like that cityscape, it becomes even
Yeah.
worse. But have you seen any success stories, I guess, in terms of management when it comes to either just a certain community, different agencies that are getting wildfire management particularly right, or at least on the right track?
Yeah. So we now have a really large body of scientific evidence that details some of these success stories, that has gone into areas that were treated using thinning approaches, using prescribed fire after fires had burned through. And those studies universally show that those treatments work. They reduce the impacts and severity of wildfires. Now, we don't have, operationally, those treatments are not being implemented at scale at the rate that we need to in order to get on top of this problem. And that's for many reasons. One is the access problem that I talked about. Another is just that it's very difficult to do each of these. Prescribed fire in particular requires very specific weather conditions in order to do it safely. Otherwise, you can get, issues with escaped fires like we had in New Mexico a couple of years ago that started a couple big fires. And so it can be quite a bit of a risk. And that's an advantage of thinning over prescribed fire, actually, is that it tends to be, there's no danger. Well, you can start a fire when thinning because you can create a spark. You can start a fire doing pretty much anything, but there's a much lower risk of that turning into a wildfire, for example. Not to say that prescribed fires aren't safe. I don't want to create the perception that they're not. They're, very effective. And there's just a few instances of those fires escaping. And that's because of these really strict rules that makes it so that we can't be treating areas all the time because every area in California, for example, needs to be treated in these 2 windows that happen every year. And so that makes it very difficult to do. A couple of good examples. One is actually takes place in that area that I told you about, the Plumas National Forest and surrounding private land in Northern California. There's a group called the Quincy Library Group, which was a collaborative forest and fire management organization that met at the Quincy Library in Quincy, California, which is the county seat of Plumas County, where this area is centered. And that was an organization where policymakers, including senators, I believe Dianne Feinstein was heavily involved in this, as well as local leaders in the timber industry, from the Forest Service, local residents, all met together to develop basically a forest treatments plan for this area. And now they weren't 100% successful. They didn't reach their full goal in the amount that they wanted to treat. But the areas that they did treat, we know fared much better following these fires, the ones that were in my study, than the areas that were not treated. And so I think that's a really big success story because it shows how these sort of cross-boundary and cross-disciplinary collaborations can lead to really effective compromise and fire management that, helps everybody. I think another good example, this is at the, larger level, and it's sort of yet to be seen, but California is finally sort of putting its money where its mouth is in terms of forest treatments, and it started allocating, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars to forest treatments. Now, they're not yet reaching their goals for the amount of treated area per year, but I think that that level of investment in thinning and prescribed fire is, something that's been called for by scientists for a long time, and seeing it, sort of happen and governments start to take it seriously is at least encouraging. And I think that other states are going to follow suit.
Yeah, I love those examples. And the first one you brought up about the collaboration, like across disciplines, I think is so important, especially right now. And I mean, as a scientist, wildfire scientists, I feel like have been asking things for a very long time as they've been studying this. But if you had to give policymakers just one recommendation in terms of shaping wildfire policy for the West, what would that be?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, my answer is the same answer that fire scientists have been, screaming at politicians for the last 30, 40 years, which is, you know, thin, 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 burn, burn, burn. We just have to put treatments on the ground at a large scale that mimic the types of disturbances of fires that we naturally had in many of these areas before settlement. And that's the way forward. That's what our science shows. That's what everybody who studies this has showed.
I guess what would that look like though? Would that look more so from a federal level, a state level, in terms of management of the lands?
Yeah, getting into specifics certainly makes it more complicated, right? I think it has to come from all sides. I know that the people I talk to in the forest products industry, these industrial timber companies, are obviously very interested in protecting their forests from fires because, if their plantation burns down before it reaches marketable size, then it's just a loss, right? And so they're thinking about different ways to implement this on their landscapes. The Forest Service is also really anxious to implement forest treatments across their landscapes. Now, they have a big problem, which is that whenever they propose a thinning treatment, which involves logging, they get sued, typically by environmental organizations like it could be the Sierra Club. There's one in California called the John Muir Institute. And these are, very well-intentioned people who care about the environment, much like you and I do, but who think, sort of contrary to science, that cutting down trees is inherently bad. And that's just not what the science shows. We have too many trees on the landscape. And it can sound counterintuitive that you need to kill trees to save them. But again, it's pretty cut and dry at this point from a scientific standpoint. And so the Forest Service, it can take 6-7 years from intending to implement a project to the time when they actually can, because it's held up in the courts for so long. And that's just, you know, it's just really slowing progress. And it's frustrating, I think, from the people that I know in the Forest Service.
Yeah, I think that's where the collaboration could come in handy. Like if
Yeah,
environmentalists,
exactly.
scientists, and then like federal workers could all come together and be like, these are our concerns and these are our goals. And a lot of times they're going to be very similar goals if you sit down and
Yeah.
actually talk about them.
Yeah,
Okay,
that is
well,
absolutely true. And that's why these collaborative sort of examples tend to be the most successful at getting this done.
absolutely. Well, I mean, we've talked about it from more so of like a policy standpoint, but for individuals, since most people who are listening are individuals, how can individual listeners play a role in supporting healthier forests within their own communities?
So, what I recommend is, especially if you live in an area that is prone to wildfires, that is affected by the wildfire problem, I really encourage you to get involved locally with your resource conservation district, with the local Forest Service office, with local sort of community organizations. Many places have these that are committed to things like home hardening, creating defensible space around neighborhoods, and advocating for nearby public landowners to conduct fuels treatments on the land surrounding your community. Those things are all very effective ways to sort of create a cushion of safety around the place that you live in.
Awesome. Was there anything else that you feel like we missed that you wanted to make sure we added, or you feel pretty good about the information you provided?
I feel pretty good. Yeah. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for having me on. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book, on YouTube, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.